What if I told you that one of the most influential architects of our time started his career as a journalist and screenwriter, wrote a book that became more famous than most of his buildings, and has spent decades deliberately making architecture that refuses to be beautiful in any conventional sense, all while building some of the most thought-provoking and culturally significant structures of the contemporary era? Welcome back to UrbArchitect, where today we're diving deep into the complex, contradictory, and absolutely fascinating world of Rem Koolhaas, the Dutch architect, urbanist, theorist, and intellectual provocateur who has spent the past 5 decades challenging everything we think we know about architecture, cities, and how we inhabit the modern world. Rem Koolhaas, known universally as Rem, was born in Rotterdam in 1944, right in the middle of World War II. And this timing is crucial to understanding his worldview because he grew up in a city that had been almost completely destroyed by German bombing in 1940, and was then rebuilt in a pragmatic, modernist style that prioritized function and economy over historical continuity or aesthetic nostalgia. This experience of living in a city that was essentially a blank slate, a laboratory for modern urban planning, profoundly shaped Koolhaas's understanding of how cities evolve, adapt, and reinvent themselves, and it gave him a perspective on architecture that was fundamentally different from architects who grew up surrounded by historical monuments and preservation culture. Koolhaas is significant not just because he's designed some iconic buildings, though he certainly has, but because he's fundamentally changed how architects think about cities, program, context, and the relationship between architecture and contemporary culture. He's the founder of the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, better known as OMA, which he established in 1975 and which has become one of the most influential and innovative practices in the world. And he's also the founder of AMO, OMA's research and design studio that works on projects that aren't traditional buildings but rather exhibitions, books, branding, and theoretical investigations. Through his buildings, his writings, his teaching, and his relentless questioning of architectural conventions, Koolhaas has created a body of work that's intellectually rigorous, formally inventive, and often deliberately uncomfortable, forcing us to confront the realities of contemporary urban life rather than retreating into nostalgic fantasies or utopian dreams. Before we get into his architecture, we need to talk about Koolhaas's unusual path to becoming an architect, because unlike most architects who know from childhood that they want to design buildings, Koolhaas came to architecture through a circuitous route that gave him a unique perspective on the discipline. He started out as a journalist and critic, working for a Dutch newspaper in the 1960s, and then became a screenwriter, even writing scripts for Dutch filmmaking before deciding in his mid-20s that he wanted to study architecture. He enrolled at the Architectural Association in London in 1968, which at that time was one of the most experimental and intellectually vibrant architecture schools in the world, a place where students were encouraged to think theoretically and philosophically about architecture rather than just learning how to draw details and calculate structural loads. At the AA, Koolhaas was exposed to the ideas of people like Elia Zengelis and Zoe Zengelis, who became his teachers and early collaborators, and he was influenced by the radical architectural movements of the late 1960s and early 70s, particularly the Italian groups like Archigram and Superstudio who were creating speculative, often unbuildable projects that questioned the entire premise of what architecture could or should be. After graduating from the AA, Koolhaas went to the United States on a fellowship, spending time in New York City and becoming fascinated by Manhattan as a laboratory of urban density, congestion, and architectural ambition. This experience led directly to his first major contribution to architectural culture, which wasn't a building at all but a book called Delirious New York, a retroactive manifesto for Manhattan, published in 1978. This book is absolutely essential to understanding Koolhaas's thinking because in it he develops the concept of Manhattanism, which he describes as a culture of congestion that celebrates density, intensity, and the juxtaposition of incompatible programs in close proximity. Koolhaas argued that Manhattan's grid and its culture of vertical development had created a unique urban condition where architecture could be irrational, excessive, and even surreal while still functioning pragmatically, and he looked at buildings like the Downtown Athletic Club with its stacking of completely different programs, swimming pool above boxing ring above oyster bar, as examples of a specifically American approach to architecture that European modernism had missed or rejected. The book is written in a style that's part history, part theory, part manifesto, and part fiction, with Koolhaas inventing stories and attributing intentions to buildings and their architects that may or may not be historically accurate, but which create a compelling narrative about how modern cities actually work. Delirious New York became hugely influential among architects and students, and it established Koolhaas as a major theoretical voice even before he had built much of anything, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. Around the same time he was writing the book, Koolhaas founded OMA with Elia Zengelis, Madeleine Vriesendorp, who was Koolhaas's wife at the time and a talented artist in her own right, and Zoe Zengelis, and they began entering competitions and developing projects that applied the theoretical ideas from Delirious New York to actual architectural problems. One of their early projects that got a lot of attention was their competition entry for the Parc de la Villette in Paris in 1982, which they didn't win but which showed their approach of creating architecture through the organization and collision of programs rather than through formal composition or aesthetic strategies. Their design proposed a series of horizontal programmatic bands that would create unexpected juxtapositions and intensities, and while it lost to Bernard Tschumi's point grid proposal, it demonstrated that OMA was thinking about architecture in fundamentally different terms than most of their contemporaries. Koolhaas's first significant built project was the Netherlands Dance Theatre in The Hague, completed in 1988, but his real breakthrough came with Villa d'Aleva in Paris, completed in 1991, a private house that showed all the characteristics that would define his mature work: a complex section with multiple levels and interconnections, an interest in transparency and visual connections between spaces, a willingness to expose structure and services rather than hiding them, and a rejection of conventional notions of residential domesticity in favor of something more dynamic and experimental. But it was his projects from the 1990s and 2000s that really established Koolhaas as one of the defining architects of the contemporary era. So let's talk about some of these major works and what makes them so significant. The Kunsthal in Rotterdam, completed in 1992, is a relatively small museum building, but it's incredibly important for understanding Koolhaas's approach to program and circulation. The site slopes from street level down to a dike, and rather than fighting this topography, Koolhaas embraced it, creating a series of ramps and levels that allow you to move continuously through the building without ever encountering a staircase. And he organized 4 different exhibition spaces that can operate independently or together, connected by these circulation routes that also function as public pathways through the building, even when the museum is closed. The materiality is deliberately rough and industrial, with exposed concrete, corrugated metal, and industrial glazing systems, giving the building an unfinished quality that was shocking at the time, but has since become highly influential. What's brilliant about the Kunsthal is how it takes a relatively modest program and budget and creates something architecturally rich through the manipulation of section, circulation, and spatial organization, rather than through expensive materials or complex geometry. Then there's the Educatorium at Utrecht University, completed in 1997, which is another masterclass in sectional complexity and programmatic organization. The building contains lecture halls, examination rooms, and a cafeteria, and Koolhaas organized these programs in a continuous folded plane that rises from ground level, becomes the roof of the lecture halls, then continues as a ramp leading to the upper levels. Its architecture is topography, where the floor becomes the wall becomes the ceiling in a continuous surface, and it creates these amazing spatial experiences where you're constantly aware of other activities happening above or below you. The building is also notable for its environmental strategy, using the thermal mass of the concrete structure and natural ventilation to minimize energy consumption, showing that Koolhaas's architectural intelligence wasn't just about form and program, but also about technical performance. But let's talk about the Seattle Central Library, completed in 2004, because this is probably Koolhaas's most accessible and beloved building, at least in the United States, and it shows how his theoretical ideas about program and urbanism can create genuinely innovative public spaces. The library was a major civic commission, and rather than designing a traditional library with stacks and reading rooms arranged in a conventional way, Koolhaas and his team at OMA completely reimagined what a contemporary library could be. They identified the key programmatic elements, things like the books themselves, reading areas, staff spaces, meeting rooms, parking, and so on, and rather than distributing these evenly through a neutral container, they created distinct platforms for each major program, stacked them vertically, and then wrapped them in a faceted glass and steel skin that makes the building's internal organization legible from the outside. The most dramatic space is the book spiral, a continuous ramp that winds through 4 floors and allows the library's entire nonfiction collection to be arranged in unbroken Dewey Decimal order, So you can literally walk from 000 to 999 without ever encountering a staircase or break in the sequence, which is a pretty brilliant solution to the problem of organizing and accessing a large book collection. The building also features a spectacular reading room with a diagonal grid of glass and steel that provides views out to Elliott Bay in downtown Seattle, while filtering the natural light. And there are these amazing spaces where you can see the different programmatic platforms intersecting and overlapping, creating moments of unexpected visual connection and spatial drama. The Seattle Library was initially controversial, with some locals concerned about its unconventional appearance and worried that it would be too weird or intimidating. But it's become one of the city's most beloved public buildings and one of the most visited libraries in the United States, proving that architecture that challenges conventions can still create successful, popular public spaces. Now we need to talk about the CCTV headquarters in Beijing, completed in 2012, because this is probably Koolhaas's most ambitious and controversial building, a massive complex for China's state television broadcaster that fundamentally reimagines what a high-rise tower can be. Instead of a conventional vertical tower or a collection of separate buildings, OMA designed a continuous loop that rises vertically from the ground, extends horizontally across the top creating a dramatic cantilever, descends on the opposite side, and then extends horizontally again at ground level to complete the circuit. This loop contains all the various programs of a television production facility including studios, offices, broadcasting equipment, and public areas, and the idea is that the continuous circulation encourages interaction and collaboration between different departments that would normally be isolated in separate buildings or floors. Structurally, the building is an absolute tour de force, with a geogrid steel structure that allows the massive cantilever, which extends about 75 meters and contains 13 stories of occupied space, to work without conventional columns. The engineering was done by Arup, the same firm that engineered the Sydney Opera House, and they developed a sophisticated structural system where the entire building acts as a continuous tube, with loads transferred through the diagonal members to the ground. The facade is composed of a triangulated pattern of steel members with glass infill, and the density and orientation of this pattern varies across the building's surface in response to structural requirements, creating a kind of diagram of the forces at work that makes the building's structural logic visible. The CCTV building has been criticized on various grounds. Some people think it's too imposing and monolithic. Others have questioned the ethics of designing such a prestigious building for a state propaganda organization, and the construction process was marred by a fire in an adjacent building that was part of the complex. But there's no denying that it's one of the most innovative and formally daring skyscrapers built in the 21st century, and it demonstrates that even at enormous scale and with complex programs, architecture can challenge conventions and create something genuinely new, rather than just repeating established typologies. Another major work is the Casa de Música in Porto, completed in 2005, a concert hall that started as a design for a private house, which is a very Koolhaas thing to do, taking a concept developed for one typology and applying it to something completely different. The building is a massive faceted polyhedron that sits on a plaza like a sculptural object, and its exterior form is derived from the internal acoustic requirements of the concert halls rather than from any desire to create a beautiful or harmonious shape. Inside, the main concert hall is a shoebox-shaped space with corrugated concrete walls that provide the acoustic performance needed for symphonic music, and this hall is carved out of the solid mass of the building at a slight angle to the exterior walls, creating residual spaces around it that become foyers, rehearsal rooms, and other supporting programs. One of the most striking features is that two walls of the concert hall are glazed, giving views from inside the hall out to the city and allowing passers-by to see performances, which is completely unconventional because concert halls are typically sealed boxes with no windows. But Koolhaas argued that this connection between the performance and the urban context was more important than perfect acoustic control, and in practice, the glass is only revealed for certain types of performances while curtains can be drawn for others. The building is clad in white concrete with windows punched through it in apparently random locations that actually correspond to interior programmatic requirements, giving it a sculptural, almost aggressive presence that divided opinion in Porto, but has become a beloved civic landmark. So what is Koolhaas's design philosophy and how does he approach architecture? This is where things get really interesting because Koolhaas isn't easy to pin down, he resists easy categorization, and his ideas have evolved over his long career, but there are some consistent themes and strategies that run through his work. First and foremost, Koolhaas is interested in in the specific activities and functions that buildings house, and he believes that architecture should emerge from a rigorous analysis and organization of program rather than from formal preferences or aesthetic preconceptions. He's famous for creating program diagrams that show how different activities relate to each other, which ones need proximity, which ones can be separated, what kinds of circulation patterns are needed, and then using these diagrams as the basis for the building's organization. This programmatic approach is very different from architects who start with a formal concept and then fit the program into it, and it's part of why Koolhaas's buildings often look unusual or unconventional. They're not trying to be beautiful in any traditional sense, they're trying to be intelligent organizations of human activity. Second, Koolhaas is deeply interested in urbanism and in the relationship between buildings and cities, and much of his theoretical work has been about understanding how contemporary cities actually function rather than how planners wish they would function. He's written extensively about what he calls bigness, his theory that buildings beyond a certain size break free from traditional architectural concerns and become more like cities themselves, with their own internal logistics, populations, and social dynamics. He's also written about junk space, his term for the generic commercial spaces of malls, airports, and other contemporary urban environments that modernist architects tend to ignore or dismiss, but which Koolhaas argues are actually the dominant form of architectural experience for most people today. Rather than rejecting these spaces, Koolhaas tries to understand them, learn from them, and incorporate their pragmatic strategies into his own work. Third, Koolhaas embraces contradictions and paradoxes rather than trying to resolve them into a neat, coherent whole. His buildings often contain jarring juxtapositions, abrupt transitions, exposed systems and structure, and a general refusal to hide the messiness of contemporary life behind a polished architectural veneer. This approach can make his buildings feel unfinished or rough, but it's intentional. It's part of his argument that architecture should be honest about the complexity and contradiction of modern urban existence, rather than presenting an idealized or simplified version of reality. Fourth, Koolhaas is interested in what he calls programmatic alchemy, the idea that bringing together incompatible or unexpected programs can create new kinds of activities and social interactions that wouldn't happen if everything was neatly segregated. This is the lesson he drew from delirious New York and from buildings like the Downtown Athletic Club, and you can see it in his own projects where he deliberately creates collision points between different programs and encourages what he calls promiscuous adjacencies. Fifth, Koolhaas has a complex relationship with technology and innovation. On one hand, OMA is known for pushing the boundaries of what's technically possible, working with engineers to develop innovative structural systems, facade technologies, and building systems. On the other hand, Koolhaas is skeptical of the fetishization of technology for its own sake, and he's more interested in using technology to enable new programmatic or spatial possibilities than in creating technically virtuosic buildings that are essentially formal exercises. Sixth, and this is crucial, Koolhaas is interested in the social and political dimensions of architecture, in how buildings reflect and shape power relationships, economic systems, and cultural values. He's been criticized for working with authoritarian regimes and for designing buildings for problematic clients, but he argues that architecture is always implicated in these larger systems and that pretending otherwise is naive. His response is to engage critically with these contexts, to use architecture as a tool for understanding and revealing the forces that shape our built environment, rather than as a means of escape or resistance. Throughout his career, Koolhaas has also been a prolific writer and theorist, and his books and essays have been as influential as his buildings. Besides Delirious New York, he's written SMLXL, a massive encyclopedic volume that combines projects, essays, travelogues, and theoretical manifestos in a format that itself challenges conventional architectural publishing. He's written Content, which looks at OMA's work through various thematic lenses, and he's produced Project on the City, a series of research studies on urbanization in places like Lagos, the Pearl River Delta, and the American Interstate System. These publications show that for Koolhaas, architecture is as much about ideas, research, and communication as it is about building, and that understanding contemporary urban conditions requires multiple forms of investigation and representation. Let's talk about some other significant projects that illustrate different aspects of Koolhaas's approach. The Prada Epicenter stores in New York and Los Angeles, completed in 2001 and 2004 respectively, show how he applies his architectural intelligence to commercial spaces, creating retail environments that are dramatically different from conventional luxury stores. The New York store in Soho features a massive curving wooden floor that serves as both display surface and amphitheater for events, creating a space that's as much about performance and spectacle as it is about selling clothes. The Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow, completed in 2015, is an adaptive reuse project where OMA transformed a 1960s restaurant into a contemporary art museum, and the approach is characteristically bold, inserting new volumes, circulation systems, and technical infrastructure into the existing structure while maintaining its industrial character. The Qatar National Library, completed in 2017, is another library project that applies the lessons from Seattle to a different cultural context, creating a vast interior space with terraced shelving that displays books as a kind of accessible landscape while providing reading areas and study spaces throughout. The building's most striking feature is the white perimeter wall that seems to be excavated or eroded, revealing thousands of books arranged in a topographic pattern that makes the library's collection visible from the entire interior. One of Koolhaas's most recent major projects is the Fondazione Prada in Milan, a complex art campus created by transforming a distillery from the 1910s, where OMA added new buildings including a striking gold-clad tower while preserving and rehabilitating the existing industrial structures, creating a complex where old and new, rough and refined, industrial and artistic coexist in productive tension. Koolhaas's impact on architecture has been enormous and multifaceted. On one level, he's influenced countless architects through his buildings, which have provided models for how to handle complex programs, how to create sectional richness, how to work with existing structures, and how to challenge conventions. On another level, his theoretical writings have shaped how architects think about cities, program, and the relationship between architecture and contemporary culture, and his research-based approach has become increasingly common, with many practices now doing extensive analysis and investigation before starting to design. He's trained a generation of architects through his teaching at Harvard's Graduate School of Design and through OMA itself, which has been a laboratory for young architects who have gone on to establish their own practices. Some of his former employees and collaborators have become major figures in their own right, people like Jark Ingels, Joshua Prince Ramus, and Shoei Shigematsu, and they've carried aspects of Koolhaas's approach into their own work while developing their own voices. Koolhaas has received virtually every major architectural award including the Pritzker Prize in 2000, the Reba Royal Gold Medal, the AIA Gold Medal, and numerous others, and his buildings have won countless project-specific awards. But he's also been a controversial figure, criticized by some for his willingness to work with authoritarian regimes, for the sometimes rough or unfinished quality of his buildings, for his intellectual complexity which some see as obscurantism, and for what some perceive as a certain cynicism or moral ambiguity in his approach to architecture. The criticism about working with controversial clients is particularly pointed, with projects like the CCTV building in Beijing and various projects in the Middle East raising questions about the ethics of lending architectural prestige to regimes with problematic human rights records. Koolhaas's response has been that architecture is always implicated in power structures, and that engaging with difficult contexts is more honest and potentially more productive than refusing to work with certain clients. But this remains a point of ongoing debate. Some critics also argue that Koolhaas's buildings prioritize intellectual concepts over experiential quality, that they're more interesting to read about than to actually inhabit, and that his rejection of conventional beauty can result in spaces that feel harsh, cold, or uncomfortable. Others counter that this discomfort is precisely the point, that Koolhaas is forcing us to confront the realities of contemporary urban life rather than retreating into aesthetic consolation, and that his buildings become more rewarding the more you understand the ideas behind them. Looking at Koolhaas's work as a whole, what's striking is its range and ambition, the way he's tackled virtually every building type from private houses to concert halls to skyscrapers to urban plans, and the consistency with which he's applied his investigative, programmatic approach across these different scales and contexts. He's shown that architecture can be intellectually rigorous without being dry, that it can engage with commercial and political realities without being compromised, and that it can challenge conventions without being merely provocative or contrarian. His work has helped move architecture away from pure formalism and toward a more complex understanding of how buildings function as social, economic, and political instruments, and his research-based approach has expanded what architects consider to be their proper domain of investigation. At the same time, Koolhaas's work raises important questions about the role of beauty, craft, and human experience in architecture, and about whether his analytical, strategic approach adequately accounts for the emotional and sensory dimensions of inhabiting space. These questions don't have easy answers, and that's part of what makes Koolhaas's work so valuable. It refuses to offer simple solutions or comforting reassurances, instead pushing us to think more deeply about what architecture is and what it can do in the contemporary world. As we look at the current state of architecture, Koolhaas's influence is undeniable. For better or worse, the discipline has moved in directions he helped pioneer, toward a greater emphasis on research and analysis, toward a more complex understanding of program and urbanism, toward a willingness to challenge formal conventions, and toward a recognition that architecture is always embedded in larger systems of power, capital, and culture. Whether you love his work or find it problematic, whether you see him as a visionary or as someone whose architectural intelligence sometimes overwhelms other considerations, there's no question that Rem Koolhaas has been one of the most important architectural voices of the past half-century, and his work will continue to be studied, debated, and reinterpreted by future generations of architects, trying to understand how to practice in an increasingly complex and contradictory world. If you found this exploration of Rem Koolhaas's work valuable, and you want to dive deeper into other influential contemporary architects with us here at UrbArchitect, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think about Koolhaas's approach. Do you find his work inspiring or problematic? And which of his buildings would you most want to visit or experience? We love hearing your perspectives, and your questions help shape our future content. Until next time, keep questioning, keep analyzing, and keep pushing the boundaries of what architecture can be, because architects like Koolhaas remind us that the discipline is fundamentally about ideas and that the best architecture challenges us to think differently about how we inhabit the world.